Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my October reading wrap up as well as a little November TBR. I feel like this month was really rough for my reading just because of the headspace I was in. I don't have the highest ratings for books this month, but I did find a really good book that I read this month. We're going to talk about all the books I read in October. Again, take these ratings with a grain of salt. They're not the best rated, but it's not anything bad about the book, more so just my headspace that I was going into this month with. I also don't actually have a lot of these books physical. For the most part, I was really utilizing my library this month. I'm trying to save money, so I'm not really spending a lot of money on books. And also, I utilized my Kindle a lot more for reading this month just because I knew it would be easier for me to pick up a Kindle and just scroll on that versus trying to pick up a paperback and going and reading that. So yeah, now that my little rants are out of the way, let's get into the books I read this month and what I rated them. So the first book that I read this month was Starling House, and I gave this book a 2 out of 5. The reason I even picked up the book is because it was a mix of two genres that I felt like were perfect to read in October. It was a mix of fantasy and horror, and so I wanted to give it a shot. Starling House, we follow our main character, who is the main caregiver of her younger brother. In the story, they honestly have a lot of bad fortune that happens to them, and they live in this small motel. She's really trying her hardest to give her brother a good life, a life that he deserves. In doing so, she ends up taking on a job as basically like a caregiver for this infamous sort of haunted house that's in this town. And that's where I'm going to end my synopsis because I don't want to spoil anything. The synopsis of the book is more interesting than what the book was. And also, I had a hard time grasping onto this story because of my headspace I was going into reading this book with. I read this book in a lot of short stints of reading, which is always really hard for me. I feel like if I'm starting a book, I need to at least sit down for an hour and just continuously read some chapters so that I get a grasp of who our main character is, who are the side characters, what is the relationships between them, and just a little bit of a grasp of the storyline that we're going to be going through. And because I read a lot of shorter stints while reading this book, I never fully grasped that until honestly probably like 70% through the book. And at that point, I didn't care. I didn't care how the story was going to end and how everything was coming together. So I feel like that book is super loved on BookTube. And if you're interested in it, maybe check it out. But I don't know. I didn't love it. That was that. The next book is another book that is super loved on BookTube that I read, and I had been on the wait list for this book for months, and I'm really upset that I did not love this as much as everyone else. So I finally got around to reading The Ministry of Time. This book took YouTube and TikTok by storm. Everyone absolutely loved this book. It is a time travel spy romance. Our main character works for the Ministry. It's in Britain, and they are basically doing a project where they take people from different eras of time, and they're basically studying time travel to see if the people can survive in the world that they get put into. It ends up being a romance between the person who works for the Ministry and the person who got pulled from time. And I didn't like that. For the longest time, I did not like the male main character. I thought he was really annoying. I just didn't like his character, and also the story itself is very slow to follow. So I was kind of fighting those two things as I was reading the book. But then once it got to like the halfway point, I actually ended up really liking our male main character and our female main character's dynamic. But I wish it would have been in a friendship way. I don't like that it was romance. I did not see any romance. I personally didn't feel the chemistry between the characters. I gave it a 2.75. I think the story is very unique, and I haven't read anything like it, but it wasn't my cup of tea. I love reading because it's so subjective. Honestly, a lot of our ratings as readers is just based off of the headspace we go into a story with, and then a mix of everything that we've lived, our past experiences. So badly do I wish I could like put on a lens or put on glasses and read a story from someone else's point of view and experience the story the way that someone else does. I want to know what people see in this book. If you've read this book and you really liked it, I want to know what about the story story you really liked. Then the next book I read was one of the 2 books I actually read a physical copy of, and I read At Last Sight by Julie Johnson. So this is the second book in the Witch City series by Julie Johnson. I've talked about the first book, Bad Luck Charm, so many times on my channel, and honestly it was kind of getting to a point, because I read that book this time last year. When I would talk about it, I was like, okay, do you really like it? Is it that good of a book? Do you really like the author's writing that much? And I can say I really do. I gave this book a 5-star. The thing about this book and about this author's writing is it's just so easy to read. It's fun to read. The male main characters are so overprotective, but like in an endearing, sweet way. I love the story, I love the world, and I love the characters so much. Sorry, I have flowers on here that she cannot eat. In this story, we follow Imogen, who is a character we meet at the end of Bad Luck Charm, and she is a clairvoyant who's kind of running from her own past. Look into like minor trigger warnings of this book. Some of the topics that are talked about could be very hard for some readers to read, but yes, she is kind of running from her past, and she ends up in Salem, where this story takes place. Obviously, it's the Witch City series, and it's just the perfect environment. I said this about the first book, and I agree for this book. You don't have to read it in October. I think you could read these books any time of the year and still enjoy it as much as I enjoyed this. Imogen ends up meeting our male main character, who is a police officer. She's put in a situation where she needs help, and he ends up helping her, and you follow them. It's so good. The found family in this series is also like my favorite thing. I love the cameos of the other characters, and we get to see what's happened with them. It's just the best. I want everyone to please give this series a chance. I really love this author's writing, and I so badly want her to continue it. I believe she has another one in the works. I think it's coming out over the summer. I'm not totally sure about that, but yeah, I really loved this book. I'm very glad I had a good reading experience with this, because I did read this in the middle of a reading slump, and I was really worried that I was not going to like it, but I think that just also shows how much I actually really love this author's writing and the story itself. And there's nothing quite like following up a 5-star read with a DNF, but unfortunately my next book was a DNF. My next book that I read was The Midnight Feast by Lucy Foley. I'm not going to lie, I have a love-hate relationship with Lucy Foley's writing. Her books are the epitome of like the same book every time, but there's a different location and different characters. I DNF'd this book because I could feel this book putting me deeper into a reading slump. The whole premise of this story, from what I understood and what I read, is that this woman basically buys land and puts like a resort on this land that has been a part of the community for ages. There's a little bit of like a haunted story, and there's some revenge that is happening. Honestly, I couldn't tell you more than that. I just really didn't care about the story. I didn't really like the writing. I don't think I like Lucy Foley's books. I really liked The Paris Apartment, and there was another book by her that I really liked, but every book that I've read since then, I've just not felt the same. The next book I read, I actually lied. I do have a physical copy of it, but it's on my bookshelf right now. I ended up finally finishing Wild Love by Elsie Silber. I took forever to read this book. I started it at the end of summer, and I wasn't impressed by it. I feel like I've heard a lot of people say that they really loved this series and these books. It's supposed to be an interconnected standalone series, and it's all supposed to be single dad romances. This book was about a guy who owns a recording studio. It's a single dad romance, but not in like the way that you would expect. And then it's his best friend's little sister, if I'm remembering correctly. Honestly, didn't care for the story. I think I'm just kind of over her writing. Not in a super harsh way, but I've read a lot of her books, and I've read a lot of her books this year. So I think I just need a little bit of a break from her writing, and yeah, I wasn't super impressed with it. I gave this a 2 out of 5. Again, please take these ratings with a grain of salt, because I was in the biggest slump and that could affect my rating. Not impressed. I probably won't continue on with the series. So yeah, that was that. The next book that I read, I actually listened to, and I listened to Death at Morning House. This is a YA thriller, and it takes place on like a remote island. Our main character in the beginning of the story has something happen to her where she basically just wants to kind of run away from her real life, and she ends up taking a job on this remote island where there's this little, you know, kind of haunted house that's infamous because of these murders that happened back in the day. And while she's she's at Morning House doing these tours, meeting these people that are her coworkers. A death ends up happening and you follow the story and the mystery from there. I really liked this audiobook. Thrilling, and there's a good mystery, but it is YA and it's not that serious. I really enjoyed the story. I would recommend the audiobook if any of you are thinking about it. I gave the story a 3 out of 5, mainly because it was just a typical YA thriller. It wasn't anything that I think will stick with me a year from now, but I did enjoy my time listening to it. Finally, after literal like 30 minutes of me just stuttering and stumbling over my words, we're finally at the last book that I read this month, and I finally read Mexican Gothic. I've been so intrigued by this story for the longest time. In this story, we follow our main character, Naomi, and she is sent on a mission by her father to go visit her cousin. She recently got married and she lives in the countryside in Mexico, in this, basically imagine like a haunted mansion, like a very gothic, eerie mansion. Her dad received a very eerie letter from her cousin, so he sends her off to go make sure that the cousin is okay. You're following her figuring out what is going on. This book is technically a fiction book, but it is also a little bit of like a horror fiction. As Naomi is in the mansion and she's trying to figure out what's happening, she has all of these obstacles because the staff doesn't want her there. It seemingly is that the family doesn't want her there, but they also don't want her to go. I think the premise of the story was more interesting than the way that the story actually turned out to be. I personally didn't love this book, but I didn't hate this book. I gave it a 3 out of 5. I would say look up trigger warnings before you read this book. Now that we are finally done talking about all of the books that I read in October, I want to talk about my November TBR, the books that are on my radar. 2 of the books I want to read this month I do have physical copies of. So the first one I want to read is The Invocations. This is a YA, I believe technically a thriller or maybe a mystery. It came out in 2024 and there's supernatural things that are happening in this story. There is, I believe, a serial killer. So I'm excited to check this out. I don't know too much more than that, and I don't want to read the back. And then the other physical copy that I have is Lady Macbeth. I'm so excited to read this. This is supposed to be a fantasy sort of Shakespeare retelling. I don't know. I'm very intrigued by this story. I'm nervous to read it because I've heard a lot of bad reviews about it, but I think this is going to be the month that I actually pick it up and give it a shot. I'm not in like my normal mood when it comes to genres. Usually I feel a big pull towards a genre, whether it be fantasy, YA fantasy, thrillers, horrors, whatever it be. But right now, I honestly don't really feel any tug to a specific genre, so I feel like my November reading is going to be all over the place. That's also why I kind of want to read this book, is because I feel like even though it has fantasy elements, I feel like this is going to read more literary fiction-y. So yeah, I'm excited for this one, but nervous, but I am excited. And then I have a few books that I don't have any physical copies of, but I really would like to read this month. Like I just said, I'm not in the mood for any of my typical genres, and usually when I'm in this mood is when I will read classics or random things that get me more thought-provoking. And because of that, I really want to read a memoir that is so popular, everyone's probably already read it. And the book I'm talking about is Just Kids by Patti Smith. Honestly, all I know about this book is that I've seen it like 100 times on Instagram, but I'm very intrigued by it. I think everyone and their brother has read it but me. So I want to actually be added to the list of people that have read it. And then this book is another book that I want to read that I feel like I've seen a lot more people talking about recently. I know nothing about this book except that it's fantasy, and this book is Phantasma. I don't know anything about this book, but I'm very intrigued by it. I've just seen a lot of people within the last month reading it, and I really want to give it a chance. So I'll have to pick that book up. Maybe we'll do a little bookstore vlog this month. But yeah, those were all of the books that I read recently, and also all of the books that I want to read. Thank you if you made it to the end of this video. I feel like I was stumbling over my words this whole time. I'm filming this after work and I have little to no caffeine in me, so I feel like my mind is not working at the same speed that words are coming out of my mouth. But thank you if you made it this far. If you like this video and if you're intrigued by my channel, make sure to subscribe and check out my other videos. I have a very exciting but also a video I'm very nervous to film coming up next, so make sure to stay tuned for that. And yeah, I'll see you in my next video. Thank you for watching. Bye.